course, is Anton Dietrich, who became known as Dietrich DUTCHOVER, whom we all know and adore as Dietrich DUTCHOVER, with these later ones. He gave a talk in 2011 entitled Mexican Cartels Infiltration of U.S. Intelligence. He gave it to the Intelligence and National Security Colloquium in El Paso, Texas. So if you know any drug dealers, send them, show them the door down, tell them to leave.
No, I need their information.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah, he's got his Master of Science in Intelligence and National Security from the University of Texas at El Paso, Master's in History at New Mexico State University, also graduate certificate in Homeland Security, graduate teaching. So I expect this to be one of the finest talks we've ever had.
Pressure.
But this seems like a man who can handle the pressure. So, everyone, please welcome Jose Jimenez.
Hey.
Thank you for being here, and for all my relatives or distant relatives, thank you. How many DUTCHOVER descendants do I have here? I know I met one earlier. Okay. All right. So my talk is not so much on what happened here in Fort Davis, even though I covered a little bit of that. I saw DUTCHOVER's life in 5 phases at least. Belgium, life at sea, the Mexican-American War, Butterfield Overland Trail, and then here in Fort Davis. I won't have time to cover all that. This is, you mentioned my national security. This was a thesis that I finished for NMSU. Initially, I started with one of the political parties in Mexico and organized crime cartels. Anyway, but I had to make a switch. So I had this always in the back of my mind to do some research because my mother had borrowed a library book from El Paso Memorial Library, and that's when I first heard about DUTCHOVER and the relationship. Anyway, Anton Dietrich DUTCHOVER as a whole, the story is about immigration, assimilation, discrimination, manifest destiny, war, and a few other things. These are stories, there are stories within this story, and I can only give you some of the stories I mentioned. What I could not verify, I saw historical events that were correlated with DUTCHOVER's life. There is some documentation out there. I did get some primary sources from the Army, but a lot of it I had to kind of see what was going on at the time, who was assigned with, and so forth, and try to get a little feel of where he was at and what kind of man he might have been. But it starts with immigration, although not of his choosing, if you've heard the story. Israel Zagwell wrote, back in the 1800s, America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen, enlightened men, Jews and Russians, and Dutch, into the crucible with you all. God is making an American. So immigration, a lot of people think Ellis Island and so forth, and then there was a place in California where people would come in, but Ellis Island for Anton Dietrich DUTCHOVER was Galveston, Texas, and it wasn't official. My historical fascination with DUTCHOVER is that he was forced from his country of birth and went on a journey that links historical existence from early 19th century European sea life to the end of the Apache Wars in West Texas. He experienced life at sea during a time of maritime technological evolution in the early 1800s, steamships versus sailing ships. He survived the Mexican-American War, although wounded, and served under U.S. President alongside the early infamous Texas Rangers. He rode as a stagecoach guard for the Butterfield Overland Mail Company, considered the first interstate of the early West, while warding off Comanche and Apache natives. DUTCHOVER was one of the unofficial founders of the community of Fort Davis, Texas, while he interacted with both the Union and Confederate armies that were stationed here, as he fended off the Apaches that would come in and steal a lot of his livestock. Finally, after the Civil War, he worked among the Buffalo soldiers stationed here that served in their role to drive the Apache from West Texas. Immigration in early Texas did not fall into a policy because Texas wasn't part of the U.S. at the time. Mexico was desperately trying to hold on to Texas but lacked the military power and economic resources to maintain it or do so. Texas was not a state of the U.S. until December 29, 1845, when it was annexed by the United States. Yet many Texas immigrants came from the U.S. as well as Mexico. Some Europeans arrived through Galveston, Texas, DUTCHOVER. This is not a path mainly historically followed, in contrast to the classical immigration of Ellis Island and the northeast coast. Historically, in the 19th century, the focus of European immigration was seen through Ellis Island, and Angel Island was the San Francisco entry point, California. Texas was made a state with Coahuila and Texas in 1824 after Mexico won its independence from Spain in September 27, 1821. Moses Austin, the father of Stephen Austin, was a shrewd businessman, essentially worked a deal with Mexico to bring in immigrants from the United States into Mexico, or into Texas rather. However, he died before he could get that done, and his son took over. In the same year, Mexico encouraged U.S. immigration into Texas. One stipulation of Mexico was that immigrants converted to Catholicism. By 1830, Mexico banned U.S. immigration. In 1835, Texas slave-owning settlers that were called Texians declared a revolution against Mexico. And then by 1836, Texas declares independence from Mexico. At the time, the people of Texas were made up of Tejanos, people of Mexican and Spanish descent, Native peoples, Comanche, Apache, and other tribes, and immigrant Americans, mostly from the southern states of the United States, now called Texians. And then there was the African slaves that were brought over by some of the Americans or Texians. These were the outliers of immigration. They didn't dream of new beginnings in the Americas, those that were forced into the southern states through slavery and that landed not in the choice but of circumstances in North America. They did not choose America. One such individual was Anton Dietrich of Belgium. Got a lot of information, so I'm going to have to skip some. So anyway, DUTCHOVER's time at sea was not clearly reported. So following general timelines, it's determined that he was on ship for almost 4 years. DUTCHOVER's age had different reports between his birth date and death. Unclear because the dates of the gravestone states 1820, death certificate 1904, and a 1970 census don't mathematically match up. I got a hold of a genealogist. Her name was Christine Smets. She's actually Belgium, came to the U.S. I think she resides in Maine now, and her specialty is Belgium genealogy. So she had an article online. I reached out to her, and she helped me with some primary sources. But we still didn't determine exactly what year he was born, 1815, 1832, or 1820. I think we settled on 1820. However, in reference to his age, if Dietrich was kidnapped in this era, it was not unusual to take 12 or 13-year-olds from Western European countries bordering the North Sea. If we consider Dietrich's abduction in 1842 and his debarkation in Texas in 1846, his time on ship would have been closer to 4 years and a little less on the actual months leading into the best estimations. The first official documentation of DUTCHOVER's age is 19 years old in 1848, which would have been the end of the Mexican-American War, according to Army records, and a target age for Army service. The common age for subjected young tailor or a cabin boy for a seafaring vessel was 13, and the right military age of 19 for his first tour of duty in the Mexican-American War that ended in 1848. So speculation put Dietrich's birth at about 1829 rather. Several stories say whether he jumped ship or they let him get off ship. I think he jumped ship. I don't think they let him off. This would have put him about 17 years old. Rough enough, where he earned some maturity at sea and strong enough to escape. Dietrich's date of birth, as I mentioned, was questioned. But when he got to Galveston, Jackie Arreola from Marfa, Texas, who interviewed Dietrich's descendants, wrote that in 1842, a young Anton Dietrich, while walking along a pier, witnessed a murder in Antwerp, Belgium. The murderer spotted Dietrich and chased him down, dragged him onto a ship, where he was drugged and essentially sold. To date, no manifest has been identified, but another version by the University of Texas at San Antonio says that he was sold as an impressed seaman. So an impressed seaman would be somebody who basically kidnapped, and this was actually by the British. This was legal. They would go hunting for people or potential sailors and snatch them up from taverns, wherever they could find them. Typically, they go to other merchant ships because they were already experienced and take those guys. So impressed sailors or impressed men is basically referring to that. So I wanted to kind of get an idea of what he went through in that sea life. Being a retired Navy guy, although I spent most of my time with Marines and special warfare, I see myself more of a brown water sailor, rivers and close to the coast, whereas deep blue sea stuff could be pretty harsh, especially in the 1800s. So one quote is, in the 1800s, long sea voyages were very difficult and dangerous, so people were understandably hesitant to become sailors. But sea captains and shipping companies needed to crews to sail their ships. So they gathered sailors any way they could, even if it meant to resorting to kidnapping by physical force with the help of liquor or drugs. The word Shanghai comes from the name of the Chinese city of Shanghai. People started to use the city's name for that unscrupulous way of obtaining sailors because of the East was often the destination of ships that had kidnapped men aboard as crew. Two main authors I took this information from, and they were around in the 1800s. One guy was Walter Runciman, a British ship owner and an author in 1870 wrote, "The average seaman of the middle of the 19th century was in many respects a cruel animal." And then the other gentleman was Richard Henry Dana Jr. Dietrich's sea life is probably the most difficult trial of his crucible. Dana, in the era of Anton's time, was actually a junior student at Harvard University. And he decided, well, I want to be a sailor, which in those days, that would have been pretty crazy, because he wasn't an officer, he was basically a crewman. So I took a lot from what he described during those times, and so I could get an idea of what was going on with Dietrich's experience. Dana dispels the romance of a sailor's life as he writes, "There's a witching in the sea, its songs and stories, and in the mere sight of a ship and the sailor's dress, especially to a young mind which had done more to man's navies and fill merchantmen than all the press gangs of Europe. No sooner, however, has the young sailor begun his new life in earnest, that all the fine drapery falls off and he learns that it is but work and hardship after all." And as far as democracy, as he adds, no fancies about equality on board ship. So imagine that quite a shock to be, let's say, 14, 15 years old and being dragged onto a ship, never to see your family again, forced to work 24/7, an unsteady vessel, and some serious sea storms and everything else that comes with sea duty. As the story goes, the kidnappers gave Anton a choice of choosing between two beans from a jar full of them, a pink and a black. Blindfolded, if he chose pink, he would be released at the next port. Black, and he would be a slave of the ship. Black it was, and he spent the next 4 years on the ship. The ship Anton was on was referred to as a windjammer or a tramp. Now, I found 3 potential sources that he might have been on. This was one called the Jean Key. just pass those around. I'll give you an idea what kind of ship it was on. And this was sail, so it was all manual work on the deck.
And this one may be actually in Antwerp, by the building.
Yes, and I believe a lot of these ships that I identified were all started from Belgium, their tour. The Windjammer was the last of the commercial ships, and the jammer was a derogatory term that the steamship guys would call them, because when they got to port, they couldn't move about as easily as a steamship because they were sailed, so they would jam up ports, so therefore the name. And then the other one was sea tramps. The average length of the sailing ship was 260 foot long with 179 foot main mast. Powered by wind sails. Three of the most common of the masts that would have from this design. Typically, the hull was built of wood, but then steel came along, which allowed them to be able to carry more cargo. Excuse me. They were usually preferred over the steamships because you could hold more cargo in them, and they moved actually a little bit quicker. The average size of the crew was 16 men or so. So imagine Anton and his 16 buddies and in the restricted space. It was made up of the captain, chief mate, second mate, steward, cook, and the crew. And from Dana's time at sea, he shares, the captain is Lord Paramount. He comes and goes when he pleases and is accountable to no one and must be obeyed in everything without question, even from his chief officer. Life at sea was unforgiving and Anton learned fast. The chain of command was unquestionable, and because the Windjammer required considerable manpower, it made for continuous hard labor for Anton and his shipmates. Here's one of the quotes from one of those authors is, no allowance was made for the youth, for his tender years. The gospel of pity did not enter into the lives of either the captains, officers, or men. He was expected to learn without being taught, and if he did not come up with their standard of intelligence, or his poor little body was made to suffer for it. This happened more or less to every boy, and our new recruit was not made an exception. The cabin boy's duties were not only numerous, but arduous, under serious physical penalties if he failed to keep the cabin. Its lamps, brasswork, clean, washed the towels, tablecloths, skippers, and mates' beds had to be made and washing done for them. Small stores, coffee, tea, sugar, etc. were under the combined care of him and the commander. And this doesn't include what he did on deck, sails and all the other work. Superstition was a big thing on the ships. They were referred to the people of the cloth as sky pilots. It was bad luck to have them set sail on a Friday and to have one of those guys on board. They would rather desert and face penalty than go out to sea with these guys. And then there was the issue of death at sea. And Runciman quotes, when a man is lost at sea, there is a suddenness in the event and a difficulty in realizing it, which gives to it an air of awful mystery. A man shot down by your side in battle, and the mangled body remains an object, and the real evidence, but at sea, the man is near you, at your side, you hear his voice, and in an instant he is gone, and nothing but a vacancy shows his loss. It's like losing a limb. The first trial of Anton's life at sea was the most demanding part of his crucible. Sea life had him face the fiercest of environmental elements, the tyranny of his fellow man, and nature's assault on man or boy. Then we get to Galveston. Here, as the story is told, he meets up with two Army recruiters, made his way into Austin. San Antonio. And as somebody was mentioning, he didn't speak English, and there was three languages in Belgium: French, Finnish, Flemish and German. So we suspect he spoke one of those languages. I've not come across him. If you've heard, let me know what language he spoke that people might have identified.
Well, it had to be Flemish. That's
Yeah.
dialect of Dutch.
Yeah, but Antwerp is pretty close to Germany, so.
No, that German bit of Belgium is in the southeast corner of it.
Okay,
And Antwerp is definitely in the Dutch-speaking part of it.
okay.
Well,
And
that
so-
suggestion was Walloon.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, but that'd be French in the south. And he was Antwerp's in the north. Like not far from the other large European port of Rotterdam, which is in Holland itself.
In any event, so since the soldiers didn't speak his language, they gave him the name of Dutch all over. There's been variations of that even in his military pension paperwork. One of them shows up without the R, Dutch Ove. So, and then if you look up some of the sources, you'll find various versions of Dutch over, Dutch all, and Dutch this and Dutch that. So he was recruited into the Texas Mounted Volunteers, which were made up basically of what we know as the Texas Rangers. They weren't considered Texas Rangers because they were not under the muster of Texas anymore. They were working for the federal government. So they were just referred to as Rangers, but everyone knew who they were. I don't know if you follow some of the Ranger history. You had Jack Coffee Hayes, William Bigfoot Wallace, and some other folks. Jump ahead a little bit. So at the time, James Polk was president, and he had a vision of manifest destiny. We won't spend a lot of time on that, but basically, he wanted to get all the territory moved towards the West Coast. But we'll go past that, and we'll talk about the first battle that Dutchover was in. It was called the Battle of Monterrey. Now, in the Battle of Monterrey, first of all, has anybody seen the movie Masters and Commanders? That's kind of the best reference I have for sea life. Remember all those young lads that were on that ship at the time? But these young lads were trying to make rank, and so they were treated a little bit better. But imagine if you weren't of money or blue blood. So, and then there's another movie called One Man's Hero. Tom Berenger, San Patricios. San Patricios were the deserters from the army, U.S. Army, who went and fought for Mexico. It also made up of British, Germans, and possibly Dutch. Essentially, a lot of them were Catholics. So during that time, the officers typically didn't treat the Irish and other Catholics very well. Lynched and a lot of things. So anyway, if you ever see that movie, it's one of the few movies on the Mexican-American War. Essentially now in Mexico, there's every year they celebrate these guys as heroes. But they were effective artillerymen. So in the Battle of Monterrey, they were there when Dutchover was there. And they were very effective. The Battle of Monterrey, this side, over here. So this particular battle was with the Texas Mounted Volunteers. If you orientate yourself, once you see this map, they came in from the north. You'll see Taylor, Zachary Taylor, General Taylor, where his initial camp was. He split up his military or his command into two sections. Worth, named after Fort Worth, took on the west side, northwest side, and then he took on the right side under another general. Anyway, where I was tracing Dutchover was that he was with the Texas Mounted Volunteers, and Hayes went down in that direction, Colonel Hayes, the ranger, and along with Worth's infantry. So what happened is, this is the north, this is Monterrey, and it's built up, it's got all kinds of buildings, cathedrals, etc., and then the town's in the middle here. Worth is coming down here with the Rangers, and then Taylor and some of his people are coming out on this side. What they eventually do is they squeeze the Mexicans into the center of the plaza. Ampudio was the general in charge of the Mexican side. It was urban warfare, and not much different what you see in the Middle East now, from building to building. In fact, I'm not sure where the Texas Rangers picked up this technique, but they were using axes and other tools to cut through the houses, through the walls. Because if they went down the main street, the Mexicans already had kind of it set up so you would get basically ambushed and easily taken out. So they worked their way into the center, and that's when they closed up the attack, or the general. At this point, the general saw that, well, the other thing is he had all his ammunition in the cathedral. And so he was afraid if that blew up, it was going to kill a lot of the civilians, but there were still a lot of people living there, civilians. And so essentially he called for a truce. Taylor agreed. I don't think it was a full surrender because they left with their weapons and headed south. So it was declared a victory for Taylor. So my purpose for tracking that was that I'm trying to figure out where Dutchover fought, who he fought with, what kind of weapons he had, that kind of thing. Being ex-military, I was an infantry medic, so that kind of stuff is of interest to me. So then we moved down to Buena Vista, the Battle of Buena Vista. And the Battle of Buena Vista is kind of west-south of Monterrey. And on the way up, there were the Mexican forces that were forced to march many, many miles on little food, little rest, little water, but outnumbered Taylor 3-1. So, ideally, the head of the commander of the Mexican unit had the advantage. And that commander happened to be on Santa Ana, Antonio de Santa Ana. And Santa Ana, that was quite a character, referred to himself as the Napoleon of the North, president of Mexico 8 times, etc., etc. Anyway, this is the Battle of Monterrey, so this is kind of the urban warfare that they might have had to deal with it. I suspect that was in the plaza area. So now we come to the Battle of Monterrey. I'm sorry, Angostura is the term that the Mexican use, which means narrow path, as well as the Buena Vista term. Now, this gives you a contrast of what they were fighting on the second battle. This is where Dutchover is reported to have been wounded.
Yeah, Mexican forces on the rooftop.
Now, when I trained, I did jungle warfare, desert warfare, urban warfare, and so you wanted to be consistent in this type of training. These guys went from fighting in house to house to fighting in open field, gullies, on a mountainside. You couldn't maneuver your cannons, so it was very, very difficult. A lot of them were volunteers. There were hundreds of desertions, both Mexican and U.S. side. So both battles were not very strategically well thought out. But he was given the victory on both of them. Santa Anna eventually would withdraw from that battle because his men were exhausted, they were hungry. They would actually go unauthorized attacks on the U.S. Army so they could steal their food, is how hungry they were. So overall, he didn't have a force that was effective to finish his battle. He took his wounded, and in the middle of the night, he started fires in the campfire, so it looked like there was people there, and they left south. The U.S. in the morning went in, Zachary Taylor's people, and it was just a horrendous scene. Coyotes, wild dogs were already eating some of the wounded and some of the dead. He didn't chase Santa Anna down. He sent a messenger, said if he wanted to have a truce. He said no. He said, well, how about exchanging prisoners? So they exchanged prisoners, and Santa Anna continued south. At this point, President Polk didn't care much for Zachary Taylor, stripped him of probably 2/3 of his soldiers, and took him south into Veracruz and then later into Mexico City. So the Rangers did not go into the second battle. They went back to Texas as far as the Battle of Buena Vista. So there was whatever Texas volunteers were left was absorbed by an Illinois volunteer unit. And this is where I think Dutchover was with. And there was a part where the battles were pretty horrendous, even in this one too. There was a bunch of desertion during one of the firefights, if you will. And I'm thinking this is where he might have gotten wounded. But in nothing I found did he ever desert, turn tail, or do anything else. He held up his own, and then would later, the war would continue down in Mexico City, war would end, and Dutchover would come out of service. So I kind of rushed through that a little bit because there's so much information, but essentially what I want to introduce was life at sea and a couple of the battles. There's more detail I'm trying to get to, but that was just some of it to give you a little bit of feel of what Dutchover went through before he even settled here. And before he became the stagecoach security guard and constable here and raised his family and so forth. So, with that said, take any questions you might have.